Chapter 20, all creased up, 1999. Detective Reyes was locked inside a cinder block walled room in the Salinas jail. It was the so-called new jail, though you couldn't tell it by the peeling paint, cracked floor drains, and rusted pipes dangling from the ceiling. The old jail was downtown by the courthouse and was about to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Apparently, the local activists refused to allow its demolition because they wanted to make it a museum in honor of Cesar Chavez, who spent 2 weeks there in 1970. Chavez was standing up to lettuce growers who tried to bust a strike by his union for California farm workers. The irony was that Chavez himself said the jail was so decrepit it ought to be torn down, and now, in his name, people were trying to save the monstrous structure. Reyes also thought it ironic that during the tumultuous time, a prison movement that took shape, led by the local Chicano farm boys, that mythically blended the ideals of Chavez and his strikers with the hardened prison radicalism of the Black Panthers. Despite this idealistic beginning, the movement ended up being a plain old criminal organization. It was, of course, the Nuestra Familia. The jail room he occupied was painted the same shade of dog puke yellow, favored by bureaucrats everywhere. But Reyes was used to jail interiors ever since his first job working corrections. Compared to those days, the gang beat was like breathing fresh mountain air, exhilarating. It was sexy. He was only a few years out of the academy, but he made it onto the country's brand new gang unit and was patrolling the farmlands, suburbs, and in towns in an unmarked black Taurus. His uniform, a pair of jeans and a polo shirt, his badge clipped to his belt. He was eager to learn more, hungry even. He sat facing a guy who claimed he wanted to drop out of the Nuestra Familia. Dropping out was no easy process. The gang's blood in, blood out oath made sure of it. Dropouts usually tried to earn some level of official protection while inside jail or prison, and to do that, they had to debrief, or in other words, snitch. Modesto Chavez, the gang investigator from Salinas Valley State Prison, had invited Reyes down to the jail. Chavez was his mentor and his hero. As an ambitious rookie, Reyes felt a natural affinity with other Latino cops like him. Most had grown up poor or working class and were trying to navigate white-dominated law enforcement hierarchies. And like him, they connected with informants by dropping the morale superiority and drawing no visible lines to divide cop and crook. And so the filling out began. Sometimes the guys would say that they were ready to debrief and then try to punk the cops by saying things the officers already knew. Others weren't deep into the gang and just couldn't provide much in the way of intel. With this dude Reyes and Chavez were meeting, it was hard to tell. He certainly looked the part. The guy was a tough-looking OG type with the fat old brush over his upper lip. He handed Reyes a snapshot of himself and Matt Rocha. Reyes vaguely remembered Rocha from his rookie days working at another jail, but Chavez explained that Matt was a well-known NF figure in Salinas. In the photo, the two men were partying down in Toro Park as if they were family. Reyes decided this guy might just be the real deal. Chavez agreed. Thus, Reyes' schooling had begun. For a dizzying 2 days, the dropout, prodded by Chavez, escorted Reyes into a world of arcane knowledge few officers in the nation had entered. The pedagogy of the NF was virgin territory. There was no class, no officer training. His education had to come from the rare mentor like Chavez and the rare ex-familianos who could show him who's who in the zoo, as Reyes liked to put it. He learned about a homicide in the Castroville artichoke fields and a bloody civil war in Salinas. He learned the gang had a military hierarchy with captains and lieutenants, led by 3 generals who, according to the gang's written constitution, could only rule from the Pelican Bay shoe. The gang was structured in 3 basic levels, starting with the Norteño kids on the streets. As Reyes knew from his own past, these were street corner soldiers whose sworn enemies were the Sureños. But when the Norteño went to prison, he would be schooled in NF history and taught the gang's strategies and tactics. If he passed the test, he could move into Nuestra Raza, a level that prison officials labeled Northern Structure. In the NR, or the structure, a man followed the gang's orders inside prison, orders that could include shanking or killing an enemy. When the NR member paroled to the streets, he tried to help those he left inside by sending love in the form of money or magazines or cash to the guy's wife and mother. Outside, he could choose to plug in a regiment or do his own thing. The choice was his. While he was locked up though, he was obligated to function. The Nuestra Raza members called themselves brothers, hermanos, or just bros. The highest level in the gang was the Nuestra Familia, which could only be entered after you killed someone for the cause, although everyone knew of members who got a rain check and were permitted to do that required hit at some later date. Even then, a made member had to sponsor you, pull you. The NF members were called carnales, or C's, and they had further status categories. Cat 1 was the lowest, on up to Cat 3, also known as the leadership group, the Mesa, the board of directors. They were like terrorist cells or underground rebel groups in that Cat 1s never knew what Cat 2s or 3s were up to. The NF's sworn enemies were La M, also known as the Mexican Mafia, as well as La M's prison ally, the Aryan Brotherhood. Nuestra Familia had its own ally. As a product of the radical 1960s, the NF aligned with the prison offshoot of the Black Panthers, the once Marxist and now greatly diminished Black guerrilla family. The Mexican Mafia and the AB wildly outnumbered the Familia and the BGF in California's prisons. But what it lacked in manpower, the NF made up for in structure. La M was feral in comparison, exercising little to no control over sureños on the streets, whereas the NF insisted its norteño youngsters be primed to put work in, study the cause, and move, as it were, up the corporate ladder. 2 days later, Reyes left the jail with his brain in the tangle. Was all this so-called structure, this sophistication for real? Chavez appeared to believe it, and Chavez was no fool. Yet, the way the inmate described the scope of the organization was jarring. How much of this was just the exaggerated aura of a few old hustlers in the shoe, guys whose faded Polaroid visages had swelled into this extravagant fantasy called the Nuestra Familia? All he knew for sure was that somewhere along the road, since he was a child, gangs sure had changed a lot. A lot. Little Tony Reyes was 8 years old when he first understood the authority of his neighborhood gang. It was inside the walls of the town church. Two teenagers, Lucio and Ricky, had been murdered on Mount Madonna. He could recall tagging along when older relatives played with the boys at the Green Valley apartments. Now, at 15 and 16 years old, they were dead. At their funeral inside the old brick church, Tony noticed that the Northside boys didn't sit in the pews with their families. They stood apart, backs against the wall, lined up in their Pendletons and their shiny shoes as if they were on guard. They stood with chins high, eyelids low, hands at their sides or loosely clasped in front to appear respectful yet ready for anything. The priest did not make them take a seat. Tony didn't know it then, but the boys' murders were the tipping point that kicked off a bitter war between Watsonville and Las Lomas. Word on the street was that Las Lomas had no personal issue with Lucio and Ricky. They'd chosen their victims for no other reason than they were Northside. The plot was shocking in its simplicity. After a quinceañera party, a couple of Las Lomas boys and a sympathetic girl lured Lucio and Ricky to Mount Madonna with the promise of an after party. They all squeezed into a car. Halfway up Hecker Pass Road, Las Lomas boys stabbed the two Northsiders, right there in the car and in front of the girl. The driver pulled over and they dragged the wounded kids through a barbed wire fence and into a field where the Las Lomas boys plunged their knives over and over, slashing and stabbing their victims more than 70 times. Even death didn't stop the ravage. The killers carved Las Lomas into one of the boys' skin, and there were rumors they mutilated the other's private parts. Ricky, muddied and dressed only in boxer shorts, was found on his back, his face tilted upward as if in supplication to God. And at first, the firemen on their way to a brush fire thought he was sunbathing and were going to warn him against trespassing. Besides all the other wounds, the firemen saw 2 bone-deep gouges in Ricky's throat. Lucio, in torn trousers but no shirt or shoes, was found face down in a nearby ravine, his head and chest bathed in his own blood. In the grass near them, a pocket-sized photo of the pretty quinceañera lay undisturbed. Little Tony heard the sobbing mothers in the front pews, and when his turn came to look into the casket, he noticed only one of the dead boys wore the traditional shirt. The other was laid to rest in his Pendleton. He didn't understand why the boys had died or why the Northside guys were there. He only noticed that they looked cool. As each Northsider approached the coffin, the dead boys' mothers glared, their eyes issuing accusations no one's mouth dared to utter. By 5th grade, Tony noticed the clothes. He saw the older boys in town walking around in Dickies, Ben Davis, and Pendletons. He asked them why they dressed that way, and the guys told him, "That's the way we're supposed to look. It's the way, things are done." He liked the look and soon imitated the 14 and 15-year-olds. Their untucked Pendleton shirts were always creased, and you had 3 creases on the back and 1 on each side of the front. The guys were buttoned all the way, with only the top button open to show a nice clean white t-shirt underneath. Your Ben Davis pants were also nice and creased, and then you had your black wino shoes. And if you were going out to the junior high sock hops, you had the shiny shoes, the Stacy Adams. Neighborhood girls dressed down with the chola look. They twisted black plastic bands around their wrists. They plucked their eyebrows and replaced them with dramatic painted arcs and wore high tees and lacquered hair. Tony noticed the girls wore Pendletons or baggy khakis with suspenders stretched over tight white tank tops. One night, their mom and dad were out working, and the Reyes kids seized the moment to invite over some friends. Their father was a foreman who worked in the fields well into evening. Their mother left for the canneries at 5 a.m. The kids often took to the streets while their mom and dad slept or labored to pay off the bungalow house and small apartment building that were to be their legacy. It turned into a giant party, and the crowd was much older than Tony. There were cholas, but normal, pretty girls too. The older boys were Northsiders, and while there was plenty of punch and chips, they drank Corona from huge guaguama bottles. Pretty soon, the oldies started playing and kids were dancing, and Tony noticed that when the older guys stood aside, they leaned back gracefully with one leg bent and a foot resting against the wall. Some wore trench coats and fedoras. They were the essence of cool. A skunky odor wafted around the yard, and he figured out it was mota. But Tony didn't try smoking any. He went inside to watch TV. Soon after, he heard a ruckus outside. Guys were cheering, girls were screaming. He ran back out and peeked over the front fence to see what was going on. In the yard next door, he saw a bunch of chola girls beating another girl. Tony watched, more fascinated than scared. He'd never seen girls fight before. The weird thing was that the guys just stood around and no one made a move to stop it. Though it was a one-sided fight, why wasn't someone pulling these girls apart? Tony knew one of the cholos watching on the sidelines. His name was Capone, and he always seemed nice because he worked at a market where Mr. Reyes and Tony shopped, and he was polite and showed a lot of respect for Tony's dad. But now, Capone was encouraging these cholas to pound the poor girl. When it was over, Tony was more confused because the guys congratulated the girls like it was no big thing. It was only later that he discovered the North Side Monas were holding a jump-in. Later, too, he noticed that the girl who'd been beaten down went from dressing like a nice girl to a total chola. When the movie Boulevard Nights came out, Tony and his friends saw themselves on that screen. The actors dressed like them, talked like them, and lived like them. With their music and their clothes and, when they were older, the cars. Tony knew he and other Chicanos had a style that was theirs alone, a clean, Mexican, American, retro Pachuco cool that others could aspire but never match. By the end of junior high, he too was creased up, smoking weed, hanging in town with norteños, and beating on their country boy sureño enemies, the Las Lomas boys. It bothered him that he could no longer visit his cousins in rival neighborhoods without getting chased out. His own blood was off limits. But he could do nothing about that. It's the way, things are done.